Hello everyone, in this video I'm reacting to Every Artist Has a Flop Era. Original video is linked in the description.
Flop era, that dreaded
Uh-huh,
chapter in every artist's career where the albums don't chart well, the
yeah,
singles miss, the vibes are off, and the
uh-huh,
fans start to panic like it's the end of the world.
yes,
But here's the twist. A
yes,
flop era isn't always a failure.
yeah,
In fact, I'd argue it's the most important era an artist can have. So let's unpack
yeah.
this. Because every artist has a flop era,
Yankee with a
and that can
brim.
very much be a good
Yay,
thing. First, let's kill the automatic stigma. Flop sounds like such a harsh word,
yes,
right? Like it automatically equals irrelevance, embarrassment, or that an artist is done for good.
yeah,
But that's not how it always works.
yes,
Obviously, it can mean those things, but that's not always the case.
yeah,
A
exactly.
flop era isn't always about quality, it's also about reception. It's
Yes,
that moment where the audience doesn't connect the way they used to. The
yes,
sound doesn't land, the look
mhm,
isn't giving, the energy is mismatched. But
yes,
in some instances, what's really happening in the background is evolution, growth, risk.
yes,
Because let's be honest, no artist stays on top forever,
nope,
and the ones who try to usually end up making the same song 15 times over until we stop noticing altogether. Let's
yes,
start with one of
exactly.
the biggest names in
That's why you
pop
have to evolve
history,
your content.
Lady Gaga.
Hmm.
After the domination of the Fame monster and Born This Way,
Hmm.
Gaga had the world in a chokehold. But then
Yes,
came ARTPOP, an album that at the time was dragged by critics,
yeah,
discarded by the public, and
hmm.
even disowned by Gaga herself for a while. People
Oh
said it was
wow,
too weird, too chaotic, too disjointed, sales dipped,
uh-huh,
headlines used the word flop like it was gospel. Some of
I
Gaga's
see.
weird creative choices also didn't help with this era, from being puked on stage to her R.
Oh
Kelly
wow,
collaboration. But
mm,
fast forward a few years, art pop has been reclaimed, resurrected,
mhm,
rebranded as ahead of its time. I'm aware that the ahead of its time sentiment has been heavily echoed around art pop for quite a bit.
yeah,
But I don't think art pop was ahead of its time.
oh,
In fact, I think it was a little late. By the time it came out, pop was moving away from the maximalist sound and
oh
into
wow, okay,
minimalism.
I see.
What I can say is, I think Art Pop is a good record that had a
Hmm.
lot of forward thinking ideas that were
I
never
see.
materialized, and it has
Nice
some of
dancing,
Gaga's
everyone.
best and career defining
Yes,
work. And more
hmm,
importantly, it gave
yes,
Gaga the space to reset, to shake off the pressure of being the perfect pop star, and go
hmm,
explore other lanes like jazz, film, and eventually Chromatica and Mayhem. A full
yes,
circle moment that paid tribute to her older sounds. All things
yes,
that wouldn't have happened without the so called flop era. Or take
yes.
Beyonce, because yes, even Queen Bee had her version of it.
Oh wow,
After I Am Sasha Fierce, which had mega hits like Single Ladies and Halo, there was
yeah.
4. Now don't get me wrong, 4 is beloved now, and even
Hmm.
had fans at the time of its release, but when it first dropped, it
Yeah.
was weirdly muted compared to Beyonce's previous albums. No massive radio hit, no cultural explosion, people were
Hmm.
confused. Run the World didn't perform like
Yes.
her other lead singles, but behind the scenes, she was freeing herself from the pressure of chasing hits and embracing
I see.
artistry.
Hmm.
Songs like I Care, Love on Top,
Hmm.
Countdown were her saying, I'm gonna do me for once. And you
Yes.
know what came right after that? The self-titled visual album dropped that broke the internet. The
Uh-huh.
flop era was a setup, a necessary pit stop on the way to artistic revolution,
Yeah.
and it worked out well for Beyonce. Because ever since then, she has rebranded as an albums artist entirely.
Hmm.
Singles are not her bread and butter. She makes a statement with an album, and it usually causes a lot of cultural conversations.
Yes.
Britney Spears' 2007 album is now often
Uh-huh.
regarded as her best work. It came out at a tumultuous period in her life,
Yeah.
involving paparazzi, relationships,
Oh
mental
wow.
health, and substances. Blackout came out as a dark and radical turn for Britney, something like she's
Oh,
never
okay.
done before.
Hmm.
The album didn't sell as well as her previous records and was shrugged off by critics and criticized for its heavy use of autotune, the
Oh
lack
wow.
of songwriting, and even the album cover.
Uh-huh.
Retrospective reviews of the album have been much kinder
Yes.
and held it as a pop masterpiece that
I see.
redefined an era of pop music and influenced acts like Lady Gaga and Charlie
Hmm.
XCX. Another
I see. I
example would
see.
be the infamous Kanye West and his
Yeah.
record 808s and Heartbreak. The man went
Uh-huh.
from the soul sample college dropout energy to auto-tuned
Yeah.
emotional minimalism.
Oh
People
wow.
hated it and even
Hmm.
dismissed it as an expression within hip-hop. Unfortunately, Kanye West was an influential figure, so that so-called flop birthed an entire generation. The influence can be heavily seen and heard in the work of Drake, Kid
Yes.
Cudi, and The Weeknd.
I see.
That album redefined what rap could be. It just took time for the world to catch up.
I see. I see.
That's the thing about flop eras. Sometimes they're not even flops at all.
Yeah.
They're just too early or too different or
Yeah.
too honest for the moment they land in. But if you
Yeah.
give it time, it makes sense. The flop
Hmm.
era can be where the artists stop chasing approval and start finding their truth. And yeah,
Yes.
it's messy, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, but so are
Yes.
most transformations. Even
Uh-huh.
Taylor Swift, who's basically the music industry's valedictorian, had a little
Yes.
stumble. After the massive success of 1989, her album Reputation was polarizing. Some fans loved it, others didn't.
Yes.
I fall somewhere in the middle personally. But Reputation wasn't explicitly about hits, it was about reclaiming a narrative. It
Yes.
was her rebuilding phase. And look at her now, Folklore, Evermore, and the All-Timer Eras Tour. She's thriving.
Yeah.
But she had to go through Reputation to get to that.
Yeah.
I think there are also albums victims of smear campaigns and persisting narratives, which
Yeah.
ultimately
I see.
overtake the album cycle. This happened to Christina Aguilera in 2010 with her album Bionic. Perez
Yeah.
Hilton admitted to running negative stories about Christina. Perez, who was a close friend of Lady Gaga during this album cycle, ran various stories painting Christina Aguilera as a Lady
wow.
Gaga copycat. Perez later claimed that Gaga encouraged him to run the negative stories. If that were to be true,
Yes.
we could say ARTPOP came back to bite her quick. But regardless of all the
see.
mess that surrounded this album, the Gaga copycat allegations were so overly exaggerated. The only commonality Bionic had with Gaga is
Yeah.
Madonna's influence. The album sounds nothing like Gaga. The
Wow.
lead single Not Myself Tonight rides the electro pop wave, but I wouldn't say it sounds like a Gaga song in the slightest. The Bionic album isn't perfect,
Wow.
but I think it has a
Okay.
lot of ambitious work by
Wow.
Christina,
Wow.
and a good amount of career highlights, from the underrated bonus track Birds of Prey to ballads like You Lost Me and Lift Me Up. There's a fair amount of gems on this record. We could also
Your
talk
Honor, is
about
the song
the
named
pop
Lift Me
group
Up
to solo
also.
artist pipeline. It can be extremely hard to navigate the world as a solo artist after you've been in a group your entire career. But sometimes those flops are just experiments that needed to happen. You have to swing
see.
and miss to know where your sweet spot is. Sometimes we do call things a flop instead of letting it breathe. But here's the truth, if you really ride for an artist, you gotta ride through the weird albums sometimes,
Yes.
the messy eras, the aesthetic experiments that didn't land,
Yeah.
because those are the building blocks for the comeback. You don't have to like every song and album by an artist. I, for one, certainly don't. But at the same time, being different doesn't always mean it's bad.
Yes,
Sometimes
exactly.
it takes a minute to adjust. And
Being
speaking of
different is good.
comebacks, and a lot of times that's when the classics
Yes.
are born. Even underground and indie artists go through it. You think just because they're not mainstream they don't flop? Sometimes they switch up their sound, lose half their fan base, and spend 2 years in the wilderness figuring it out. With that era of confusion, that's essential. That's how you end up with the breakthrough projects.
Yes.
That's how you turn niche into legacy.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, life itself is a flop era sometimes. We all go
Yes.
through chapters where nothing's clicking, the vibe is off, the vision is blurry. But
Yes.
this doesn't mean we're done, it just means something is shifting. The
Yeah.
same way artists need to fall off to find new ground, sometimes so do we. And maybe
Yes.
that's why flop eras resonate so much, because they're human. They remind
Yes.
us that greatness isn't a straight line, it's full of stumbles,
No,
resets,
it's
and
not.
redemptions. And I think that's why people also tend to try to find redemption in a flop, even
Yes.
some that don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Because there are flops that are just purely flops, with absolutely no redemption arc. So
Yeah.
while I think having a flop era is really par for the course for every popular artist eventually, unless you're someone like Rihanna, and I also believe that flops can lead to great things or even be
Yes.
recontextualized with time, there are also many instances of a flop just being a flop, a bad
Yes.
album, a bad career move. I feel like present day there's a redemption arc given to every album that doesn't do well. But not every album is ahead of its time, and not every album deserves redemption. But once again, on the flip side, there are many great flop albums and flop
Yes.
eras. Maybe they're just growth in disguise. Maybe
Yeah.
they're the moment the mask comes off, the formula gets thrown out, and the real artistry begins. Sometimes
Yeah.
a flop era is where the good shit starts.
Yes. So yeah, if you enjoyed my reaction to this video, you should subscribe to my YouTube channel, turn on all post notifications. I hope everyone has a great day. Bye!